just surprising when you read the commentaries on Job, how disparate, how contradictory and divergent the interpretations are, particularly with regard to Elihu and his part in all this. But I take the position and argued in the elective course I'm teaching right now that Elihu really is an important person in this book, that he is doing what Job wants, but not in the way Job has expressed it. He wants somebody to bring him back to an open relationship with God, in a sense of face-to-face. And in Job, he says, "You've hidden your face from me, and I don't know your presence as I have in the past." And in his final monologue in chapters 29 to 31, that's what he says. He says, "In the past, I walked with you, and the sun shone on me," and he's not just thinking about the fact that he was blessed materially and physically with respect to health, but that he knew the presence of God. And now, and we'll look at this at the end of the semester with regard to lament psalms, that there are times in a believer's life where God just doesn't seem there. That's the emotional experience. That's the mental perception. We know God is there. We know God never forsakes His own. We know that God cares, but it doesn't feel like it. We don't see it. We're experiencing opposition. The enemy is winning. And so we will express to God the fact that you're not there and the enemy's winning, and why don't you care about me? Knowing that He does, but that's not what we're feeling. And that is like Job's experience. And so he wants somebody who can bring him back into that sense of the presence of God that he has enjoyed before. And Elihu is the person that does that. But he doesn't do it the way Job wants him to do it. He wants somebody who will come and explain God's charges so that he knows how to address it, how to justify himself, or how to repent if that's what he needs to do. His friends have not convinced him that that's what he needs to do. We know that that was not the issue. And so we do see Elihu doing this, and in his third speech on God's freedom, he says God is free, He's not inattentive, He's not unconcerned, He's not wrong in the way He governs His universe and the way He deals with His believers, with people. And so basically Elihu says, wait for His self-disclosure. He will disclose Himself as He chooses, when He chooses, if He chooses. And His great object lesson of that is the clouds. And so he was not able to hear God at this point because he was so busy chewing over the whole issue of retribution theology with the three friends, and then talking to God and fuming about how he wasn't being treated fairly in a justice sense. And so Elihu brings him to the point where he can hear God. And basically what he's saying is, shut up and listen. Now that's a rough paraphrase of the whole book. Shut up and listen. and that really is what Elihu does. He talks to Job, he talks to the three friends, he corrects both of them in certain areas. What he corrects Job about, and again, it's not, the book says Job didn't sin with his mouth. God says to the three friends, you haven't said what is right about me as my servant Job. So it's not a sin that he has committed in terms of saying something wrong about God, but being impatient with God's ways and not fully appreciating the freedom of God with respect to how He acts. So Elihu is bringing Job to that point. And as you look through the Elihu dialogues, the Elihu speeches in detail, you will see that that's what he is doing. And so he says, behold, God is mighty in discriminating understanding. He exalted in His power to instruct. He is magnificent in the deployment of His clouds. And so in chapter 4, he is holding God up primarily in this whole area of His freedom. That God is free to deal with His creation, all of His creation, including those people who believe in Him and who are closest to Him as far as people and fellowship with God is concerned, He is free with respect to how He deals with us. And so that is the great thing that Job needed to become aware of. That's where his faith needed stretched. It needed expanded. You know, an imperfect faith is not sin. It's growing faith. It's faith that isn't completed yet. And so this is where God is working. And so He points to the clouds. And did we get this far? Okay, I think I wanted to hurry through this. He points to the clouds and He says they're amazing in their composition. They are mysterious in their deployment. They are complex in their manifestation. They are awesome in their effect. And they are diverse in their accomplishment. And just as the clouds are these, so God with His creation and with His people. And so the intent is that Job will come to see that the suffering in his life is something that ultimately is inexplicable, that he will ultimately never have a divine perspective on. And so all of his fuming about wanting understanding about his situation is for naught. Because what Elihu is saying is, God is free to give you or not give you reasons for what He is doing. And at that point, and when we get to the end of the Elihu speeches, Job doesn't say anything. And several times through those speeches, Elihu says, now Job, listen to me, and let me instruct you, and if you have something to say, then say it. And Job never says anything. He doesn't get in an argument with Elihu. And that really gives us a clue to Elihu's part in all this. So finally, in speech 4, in the conclusion, we find Job's folly exposed in chapter 37, verses 19 to 21, that basically he has just been talking when he should be listening. That God's awesome majesty is summarized in these passages, and then that the key to the fear of the Lord is placing humble faith in the God who exercises sovereign grace, even when in the crucible of inexplicable affliction. So that Job just needs to rest in the fact that God doesn't make mistakes, but God doesn't always tell us what's going on. Now that really is a practical lesson just in that far, in that we tend to think a couple of things about our life with God. We tend to think that He relates to us so positively because we are such wonderful people and relate to Him so positively. That's not true. He relates to us positively out of His grace. And when we relate positive back to Him, it's just a little tiny reflection back of what He has first extended to us. Now, Job wasn't unaware of that. But when you get into suffering, those kinds of things sort of become skewed and unbalanced. And the other thing is that we operate, and our relationship with God is based upon our understanding of what's going on. That's not true either. It's still what God has revealed, and when He wants to speak to us, when He wants to discipline us, when He wants to show us the reasons for negative things in our lives, He is fully capable of doing that. And Elihu brings that out very clearly. But God doesn't deal with us. Our relationship is not based upon our understanding of how it works. It's based upon Him and His revealing Himself and our responding to that. And so humble faith in the God who exercises sovereign grace, even when in the crucible of inexplicable affliction, He is free to deal with His own as He sees. And the clouds, when suffering comes, what's it for? Who knows? We'll never know all that God is doing through any circumstance or situation in our lives, in the lives of someone else, or in the whole creation. And so we have to let God be free. Let God be God. And what we want to say is it's not fair. Anybody ever said that? The rest of you are asleep or... Okay? Sure. All of you who have siblings have said that. Mom, it's not fair! And what did she say? Life isn't fair. Fairness isn't the issue. It's what he needs, not what you need, and I'll deal with you as I should deal with you. Now, parents have the right to do that. Parents don't always do it perfectly. Sometimes parents do not deal equitably with children. But fairness is not the issue. God is free. And that is a way to look at the message of Job. And the clouds illustrate that. They're wonderful, they're powerful, they do great, wonderful things. Without the clouds, we wouldn't have water. Without water, we wouldn't have food. Without food, we would die. So the clouds are absolutely critical to life on earth. And yet we curse the clouds when they come and destroy property and life, don't we? But the one and same feature, the one and same aspect of creation God uses for His greatest positive benefits and also for His most severe judgments. And that's the point Elihu makes and points Job to. Look to the clouds. Now, the contribution of these speeches to Job himself is that it shifted his focus, it prepared him to hear. And this is a critical ministry to Job. The three friends did not prepare Job to hear. The three friends only incensed Job, drew him into arguments, drew him into saying some things that he might not have said otherwise, things that were foolish, though not necessarily sinful, and really kept him from hearing what God wanted to say. And so it shifted his focus. And so Elihu does what the three friends did not. He says some of the same kinds of things the three friends say, but he comes down on a different side. He takes them a different direction. And a careful reading of the text bears that out. He also contributes to the message of the book. By content, obviously, in that he says the sovereign grace of God is exercised in freedom, not in caprice. That is, not just willy-nilly, no sense. God is free to act, and we assume that when God acts, He acts with purpose, He acts with consistency within Himself, He acts in wisdom, but there's no way we can understand and compute all that. We're finite. And for God to sit down and try and explain it all to us would be a waste of His breath, metaphorically speaking, because we wouldn't be able to track with it. We might think we could, but what is Job's response when God starts talking to him in the last chapters of the book? God simply says, do you understand my way with creation? Do you understand my way with the way I direct creation? Do you understand any of it? Job says, no. And what is left unsaid, but is there clearly in the text, is, well, then how could you understand my way with the clouds as they deal with all people that come under their effect? And so, by content, that is what he's doing. By structure, Elihu also contributes. Elihu is as enigmatic as the clouds. He is as enigmatic as the clouds. I don't know if I have this on here, but he appears unexpectedly. We don't know he's been there listening. He does his work, and then he just drops out of sight. And nothing is said about him at the end of the book, good or bad. Now, some will conclude, well, that means Elihu was a bad guy, because he didn't even get the chance to have sacrifices offered for him. I don't think that's it. He's just like the clouds. He drops in unexpectedly, does his work, leaves abruptly, and you say, what was that? And that's what we say about the clouds. But he does God's work in preparing Job to hear. Enigmatic, kind of a puzzler, kind of, he's kind of a, what is that? Enigmatic. Yeah. Somebody give me a synonym for enigmatic. Puzzling, huh? Enigma is not a synonym. It's the root form of the word enigmatic. Something that just isn't quite figurable, isn't quite determinable. You just can't quite figure it out. That person puzzles me. I'm not ever quite sure where they're coming from. Difficult to interpret or understand. You got a dictionary there? Good. Difficult to interpret or understand. Thank you. One good use of computers in class. Okay? One. There's a whole bunch of bad uses, but there's one good one. That is one good one. Yeah, so difficult to interpret or understand. Just, yeah. Like some of you feel some of my questions are enigmatic on tests, but they're not really. Yeah, so he's just a puzzling person, a puzzling part of this whole picture. But as you look at it, as you read it, as you think about him, then you see, oh, that's what it's about. And that's the clouds. The clouds, he's like the clouds. Yes? No. No, because he says at the beginning of his speeches, I've been sitting here listening to you guys. I'm young, you're old. Age is wisdom. I deferred to you. You haven't. You've condemned Job, but you haven't explained why. And therefore, I have to talk because I've got a perspective on this that's needed. And I think he does. I think everything he says is true. He's not just bragging. He's not going to just take it in another negative direction. So no, he's not an angel, but he does serve the role of a and in the book, there's several different words used for the idea of a mediator, an arbiter. Actually, the one that's most used is the idea of an arbiter. You've heard about like unions and companies that are in conflict and they can't work out, and so it'll go to binding arbitration. You ever heard that term? They bring in like a federal arbiter, and he looks at everything and he says, okay, here's my judgment. This is what's going to happen. And so it's someone who comes in to bring two sides together in some kind of a legal dispute. And so that's what Elihu does. But he doesn't do it by giving Job information about his situation. He does it by giving Job information about God's ways with regard to suffering. And he does it by, illustrates it by pointing to the clouds. And he says it's just like the clouds. Okay? So he's as enigmatic as the clouds. Now, to the counselor of a sufferer, I think there are some important things we can learn. And you flip over to Elihu's model of ministry to the afflicted. Elihu's model of ministry to the afflicted. When somebody is in great pain through something they're experiencing, Elihu, and the friends do this to begin with, you know, the chief thing is to wait and observe. That's what Elihu did. Now, how many of you had trouble getting through the cycles of speeches in Job? Yeah. And if you started reading those at midnight, you know, you woke up in the morning not having finished them. I mean, it's hard to get through, isn't it? Elihu was sitting there and tracking with that whole thing. Okay? So he was waiting, he was observing. He didn't start out by talking. And that's an important lesson for one who will come alongside somebody who is in pain. Secondly, evaluate. He thought about what was being said. He thought about primarily, you know, Job's approach to this problem, and he thought about it in terms of who God is and what the truth is and where Job was. And so, you know, he just didn't fire off the first thing that came into his head. Oh, bad karma day, huh? No. The next thing he did is when he did begin to speak, he identified with Job as a person. He basically said, I hear you, I have something to say, but I'm on your side. I basically want you to be whole again, and I'm here with you. I'm not just here to condemn you. I'm not here to rag on you. I'm here as your friend, as your helper, truly as somebody who will be of service to you in this. Now, he did speak. He didn't just say, oh, it will be okay. He didn't say, oh, there's nothing wrong. He didn't say, oh, you're just fine. He did speak. And he did say some things to Job that Job needed corrected on with regard to God. But what he spoke was the truth about God. Now, having said that, the truth about God, he went beyond quoting Romans 8:28. Well, all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called to His purpose. There, that seals the case. Let's go to a movie. That doesn't solve the hurt that people are going through and suffering. Most Christians who are suffering already know that verse. They already affirm it. Okay? But suffering, brings just all kinds of dynamics to living in God's world, even with a developed faith. And so he did speak truth about God with regard to things like suffering. But what he didn't do was what the friends do, and that is try and identify what the source of the problem was. Because he knows smart enough to know he can't do that. And so instead of speaking to what he understood the problem to be, he honestly admitted that he didn't know what the problem was, and he wasn't going to try to uncover what the problem was. He simply directed the focus toward God. And basically what he says is, Job, you've been saying a lot of things to God and about God, and you've been arguing with your friends. What you need to do is be quiet and listen. Wait for him to speak. Because ultimately, when a person is suffering, that's what they need to hear, and that's the only thing that will bring them out of it, when they just have a sense that God has spoken to them. And I say that in a broad metaphorical sense, that he's the one who has communicated. Because quite frankly, we will never have the perspective on another person's suffering so that we can speak as God speaks. We don't even have the perspective on our own suffering so that we can say, this is what it is. And so Elihu in his wisdom, and he says he's wise, and he is, I think, is that he comes and he identifies with Job in such a way that Job listens to him. He speaks what is truth about God, which the three friends didn't. They said God is just somebody out there. We pull the lever of wickedness and he, fills the funnel of punishment. We pull the lever of righteousness and he fills the funnel of blessing. Now, that's all God is. In a sense, that's what they're saying. And that was wrong. Job knew that was wrong. But what he didn't know is why he was experiencing this. And so there were right things to say about God, and then he directed his focus toward God. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he trusted the Lord for the effects. I can't move another person in regard to faith and in regard to responding to God. He got to the end of it, and he finished his speech, and then he stopped. The three friends said, now, Job, repent. And I believe they would have only been satisfied in regard to what they were seeking to do as if Job would say, okay, this is what I did. This is the sin I made. I repent. And they would have said, good, that's what we were trying to get you to the point of. And that's clear what they were doing through the whole first part of the book. Elihu doesn't do that. Once Elihu states what he thinks Job's issue is here, and he goes through what Job needs to do, and he directs focus to God, and he illustrates it through the clouds and various meteorological phenomena that are associated with the clouds, then he stops because he knows he's not the key. God is. And so he trusts the Lord for the effects. And I assume that he would have been there and sitting there and with him as long as is needed, but this is, then God begins to speak. And when God speaks, then Job responds. And basically, God's speeches are designed to show Job that he doesn't understand God's ways. He doesn't understand the creation. He doesn't understand God's providence over his creation. And so Job is marked as not able to understand even the simplest things of God's creation of the material universe. How is he going to understand the more complicated things of how he uses clouds? How he uses events in the lives of all his creatures interacting all at once in a larger context. Really, Lamentations chapter 3 is a passage that kind of encapsulates what Elihu's message is to Job. We know Lamentations 3 because it talks about the Lord's mercies are not, through the Lord's mercies and we're not consumed, His compassions fail not, they are new every morning, great is your faithfulness. That's the extent of our knowledge of Lamentations chapter 3. But Lamentations, that's in the context of a larger message. Lamentations, we'll read second semester, is a work of Jeremiah where he is bemoaning the destruction of Jerusalem. And he is suffering. He is suffering as God has suffered in terms of the disobedience of His people. He is suffering over the tragedy that has befallen the city, is the tragedy that has come upon Israel. And so in verse 19 he says, "Remember my affliction and my roaming, the wormwood and the gall. My soul still remembers, and it sinks within me." So he is in the crucible of pain and suffering. "This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope," and the "this" then is what follows. "The Lord's mercies, through the Lord's mercies we're not consumed, because His compassions, they fail not, they're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." So he directs his attention to God and His faithful character in the midst of the destruction that God has just directed against Jerusalem. "The Lord is my portion," says my soul, "therefore I hope in Him. The Lord is good to those who wait for Him." And that's one of Elihu's direct statements to Job. Wait for Him. He will reveal Himself. Wait to see how He does it. "Therefore," "the Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the soul who seeks Him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly." See, waiting and fuming do not go together. Be quiet and wait. Listen. "It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope." Let him put his mouth in the dust. What kind of a figure is that? Well, we'd say something like, let him stuff his mouth with marshmallows and try and sing the national anthem. Yeah, that's what we do at Young Life or something, yeah. Okay, if your mouth is full of dust, you can't talk. And that's the metaphor. Be still, be quiet, wait, listen. And that's exactly what Elihu was bringing Job to do. And so, that's the counsel here. That's the counsel that Jeremiah receives for himself. In your mourning, in your consternation, in your great perplexity over how this could all happen and so forth, wait, be quiet, and wait for the salvation of the Lord. Wait for His deliverance. Wait for Him to reveal Himself. And so that's what Job does. The hymn we have, "O tell of His might, O sing of His grace," is Mr. Glock sung this with you in class yet? Okay. "Whose robe is the light, whose canopy space, His chariots of wrath, the deep thunderclouds form, and dark is His path on the wings of the storm." Now, God comes on the clouds and storms sometime. "Thy bountiful care, what tongue can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light, it streams from the hills, it descends to the plain, sweetly distills in the dew of the rain." Two almost opposite effects of clouds. The tremendous thunderstorm that just, can bring water and tear things apart, or the gentle rain that just distills on the earth and causes things to grow. So Yahweh's speeches, and you have this at the end of the notes just before Job here on page 40. Yahweh's speeches, mere man cannot comprehend God's creation. And so he just says, "Were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did this?" And Job answers nothing. Mere man cannot control God's creation. And so Job understands himself and God better as a result. And let me just read that section. So Job answered the Lord, I know you can do everything, that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Listen, please, let me speak. You said, I will question you, you shall answer me. And then he says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. And again, it wasn't some great sin. It was just the recognition that in his mind he was presuming himself to be able to understand and comprehend more than he could. And now he sees that what God was doing was apparently beyond his understanding, beyond his ability to understand. And so God had chosen not to tell him at that point. And that God had a purpose in it that Job couldn't even begin to fathom. And so he waits, and through God talking about, again, his relation to creation in terms of its coming into being and in terms of his control over it, God makes his point. Now the interesting thing is Job's prosperity is restored, but out of God's grace and freedom, he wouldn't have had to. And Job had come to the point, I believe, where he would have been fine with that. And that shows us, that the book is about the development of Job's faith, not the increase of Job's understanding.